Guys, welcome back to another exciting episode of Call Up Podcast. I'm Kenny, and today we finally hit our goal. We got Chris Van Vliet here. We get to pick his brain and get to know him a little bit more. Chris, how are you?
Kenny, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Man, we're so glad to have you here. I've talked about you so many times throughout these, the many episodes I've done so far.
Good things.
I think people are just wondering. It was like, when was it going to have you on the show finally? So we finally got you here. We're going to finally pick your brain. Doing some research on you, there was something that was very interesting to me, that I really didn't see throughout your posts, or you really don't talk about it too much, but you won an award for bass fishing.
Man, you dove deep into this research. Yeah. I mean, I'm a passionate person, right? I'm super passionate just by my personality type. So bass fishing has been a thing that's been a really big part of my life since I was a kid. I caught my first fish when I was 4 years old, and pun intended, I was hooked. And I've been fishing in bass tournaments since I was 14. And I grew up in the Toronto area, so you fish around there, and the Great Lakes are not far from there as well. And 5 years ago, my fishing partner and I, Aaron Andrews, who's one of my very best friends, we started a bass fishing company called Woo Tungsten. That's WOO exclamation mark Tungsten. We sell tungsten bass fishing weights. So yeah, bass fishing, wrestling, broadcasting, these are things I'm super passionate about. And when I'm passionate about something, man, I dive all the way in. I don't check the temperature of the water. I don't check the depth of the water. Let's dive in, figure it out when we get there.
When was the last time you went bass fishing?
It's been a while, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit this because I own a bass fishing company. But when you own a fishing brand, you do a lot less fishing than you did before you started it, because I was living in Florida. I lived in Florida for 5 years. I was living in South Florida, about an hour away from Lake Okeechobee. By the way, we're going to go into the weeds here for a second with the bass fishing talk. About an hour from Lake Okeechobee, which is one of the best bass fishing lakes in the world. And I owned a bass boat. So on weekends, I would hook it up to my pickup truck, drive to Lake Okeechobee, fish for the day, and then come back. And then I started to realize as I was building the business that was my time really the best spent on the lake, like waking up at 3:30, 4 in the morning, hooking up the boat, driving to the lake, fishing, catching, a handful of bass and back? Or was it better spent working in the business and on the business? So it's been a while. Now that I live in California, I'm near some pretty great bass fishing lakes here too. So it's just a matter of time till I get back out there. But I'm embarrassed to admit it used to be 150 days a year, and it's nowhere close to that anymore.
Well, hopefully now with everything opening up, you will be able to get out a lot more. But even with stuff opening up, that means you're just going to be a lot more busier now with, with a lot more interviews.
Well, look, we're all busy, right? It's just a matter of where do you want to point your time? We've all got a ton of stuff going on in our life. And it's just a matter of all right, which bucket am I going to kind of pour some time out of and into this other bucket? So maybe I need to take from the interview bucket or the working out bucket, or I don't know, any of these other, the content creating bucket, and maybe pour it into the fishing bucket every once in a while.
Right. So you said you lived in Ontario, Canada. That's where you grew up at. You were born and raised there. And then you moved out to the States to pursue your dream a lot more after you had a ton of gigs out there. So how was this transition from being in Canada to coming here to the States?
So I moved when I was 26, and the first city I lived in was Cleveland, Ohio. And man, what a great city to be in, and also pretty close to home. I was about a 5-hour drive from my hometown just outside of Toronto. So it was great. And Cleveland welcomed me with open arms. And I have such a huge place in my heart for Cleveland. It's just such good people and so many great memories there. But I think when you grow up in Canada, so much of the culture there is definitely impacted by the US. All the television you're watching is American television. Most of the sports you're watching are American sports. Sure. I mean, we played hockey, watched hockey growing up, but still most of the teams in the NHL are American teams. So I feel like you're definitely influenced by American culture. And I took a lot of trips to the US when I was a kid. I mean, a drive to Buffalo, New York was not even 2 hours away. Wow. So there was a lot of that when you were a kid. So I was definitely aware of American culture. So when I did move to the US, it didn't feel like a huge culture shock at all. Although I will admit, Kenny, I had a really bad Canadian accent that I had to work on like dropping as I was starting to pursue a career in the US. You know, it wasn't terrible. If you go back on YouTube and watch some really old videos like 07, 08, 09, you'll hear me saying things like, sorry about that. We'll get to that tomorrow.
I mean, but that's a given because, you know, with the accent and then, you know, coming over here, it'll like slowly but surely it'll go away. You know, me growing up as a kid, I'm from a Spanish household. So I learned Spanish first growing up. I was yeah. So me being a kid, I only spoke Spanish when I was younger. Yeah. So then when my parents finally, you know, they put me into school, I learned how to speak English while being in school. So like, you know, the teachers there taught me like proper English and how to say things. So like when I was around other people, they'd be like, you speak very well. I'm like, well, yeah, because I got taught in school.
Well, now you've got the perfect New York accent.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Now. And it's crazy because for me, I don't feel like I have an accent, but when I go other places, that's the first thing that they will come out and say. They was like, you're not from around here. Yeah. And I love going to Florida all the time and like different places. And they'll be like, yeah, you're not from here. And I'm like, well, where do you think I'm from? And I'm like, you're from New York. I can hear it in your voice. Like,
but I mean, your accent is so, it's not just New York. You have the Brooklyn accent.
Yeah. And you know, the crazy thing about it is like, I've been living in Brooklyn now for the last 5 years, but I've lived in the Bronx like all my life. But
you have the Bronx. You definitely have the Bronx accent. What am I talking about?
So you've been in the entertainment business for so long. You did everything from being an intern to being like, you know, a host of different, you know, TV shows and radio shows. What was like your favorite gig that you've held down so far? Man, besides your own show?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty cool, but nailing it down to just one's like, you know, naming your favorite child, which I don't have any children, but I imagine would be a very difficult thing to do. I think that each one in my career has had a really special place because I was handed nothing throughout my career, ever. I was never the guy who got the phone call from a TV network or even a phone call from an agent going, we've got the perfect gig for you. I worked my ass off to even just shove my foot into the door and even get an opportunity. Like my very first job in the industry was a job I basically lied my way into. I mean, if we take it back a little bit, I had an epiphany in my senior year of college. I loved college. I was studying communication studies. I was having an awesome time there. I lived with 4 of my best friends. And then it hit me one day in my senior year that, oh my God, when we graduate at the end of this year, we got to go work, you know, for the rest of our lives.
Oh yeah.
And it wasn't like, you know, when you're in school, if you miss a class, you miss a class, whatever, you can make up for it. Well, if you decide one morning you don't feel like going to work, it doesn't really fly for very long, you know? I think you get fired after a while.
Yeah.
So it really hit me hard that after graduating, I was going to have to do this thing for the rest of my life. And I decided in that moment, I didn't want to hate it. I didn't want to be one of those people who couldn't enjoy Sunday because Monday was the next day. So I reached out to every radio station, every TV station in my college town and just said, really passionate about broadcasting. I'm a communication studies major. Can I come in, volunteer, and just see how it's done in the real world? And one radio station got back to me and said, sure, come be part of our street team, hand out like stickers at events. This other TV station, which was a community-run TV station, run all by volunteers, they said, of course, please come in. I got to work behind the scenes doing audio, VTR, floor directing, cameras, all that kind of stuff. And then this other radio station said, well, we don't take on volunteers, but how would you like a job?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Sure. Yes. They said, well, it only pays $8 an hour. I said, that's $8 more than I thought I was going to make.
Exactly.
And I was a board operator at this news talk radio station. So running the board behind the scenes. And then when my shift was done, I would go into the recording booth and then record in front of a mic. So I'd have actual like demo reel. And then when it came time to graduate, I'm like, well, I think I need an internship to try to hopefully build my demo reel so I can get on TV and have something to show. And this is where the lying comes in. I wasn't getting any response to any of the emails I was sending out about an internship. So I looked up the email for the general manager of this small station about an hour from my hometown. And I sent him an email and said, I'm going to be there in Peterborough, Ontario in the next few weeks for spring break. If you have some time, I'd love to come by and talk to you about an internship. This was a total lie because I'd never been to this city and I hadn't been there like the last 10 years.
Right.
But I figured if I could put myself in that city, how could they possibly say no?
That's true.
And it worked. He said, if you're going to be in town, yeah, come on by 10 o'clock. And I went in, he looked at my resume and said, well, it looks like you've done some stuff here. And because I had built it up with this volunteer work in my college town, gave me an internship. Long story short, the internship ended up turning into a job. And it was an hour away from my hometown, like I mentioned. And I went back to my high school job at the mall. I was working at the pet store in the fish department so I could pay for the gas to drive to my internship. So I think that might be my favorite job, if I'm to answer your question, because I worked so hard to get that one. And then the next job after that was in Vancouver at MTV2 Canada. And they had no interest in bringing me in for an interview, no interest in auditioning me. And I did a really similar thing. I knew the name of the person who was doing the hiring. It was on the application. And I called the TV station randomly and asked for her. I said, hi, is so-and-so there? And they said, one moment, please. And I went, oh my God, this is going to work. And she didn't answer the phone, but I left a voicemail. She emailed me right back and said, yeah, we're going to be looking at applications. We'll get back to you. In the signature of her email was her direct phone line. Oh. And I gave her a call a few days later. And she answered the phone. I called her directly at her desk. She answered the phone. I said, hey, I'm going to be in Vancouver next week. Again, total lie. Vancouver's like a 5-hour flight from Toronto. And they ended up giving me the job. So I think it's those types of stories of perseverance and not giving up that makes me appreciate those jobs that I had early on in my career. Because actually, that's been the case of every job I've ever had.
You know what? And that's great to hear, because there's other people who are out there right now trying to pursue the same dream. And, they can sit there, listen to this and be like, you know what? He just went out there and hustled his way to get to where he is right now. And he didn't let anything stop him. He figured out somebody's telephone number or email address. I guarantee you, if you probably would have known where they live, you maybe would have dropped a note.
Well, I don't want to get don't want to get arrested or anything.
But I've heard of stories like that where people will go and be like, hey, I know where this person likes to go and get lunch. So I would just randomly go there and maybe bump into them and just say hey, aren't you such and such? Just to get their attention.
Yeah, there was a story of a host at one of the TV stations that I worked at. He sent a cake to the TV station with his face on it.
Wow.
And they didn't end up responding. So then a few weeks later, I can't believe this worked for him, but it did. He ended up hosting a TV show there for years. He showed up at that TV station and said, oh, hey, I've got a 12 o'clock meeting with, the boss. And they went, oh, we don't have your name here. Let me check. And then they called and said, no, we don't have your name. He said, I swear I have I'm a meeting at 12 o'clock. And they went back and forth a few times. And finally,
let them in.
Yeah, finally the boss came out and said, who are you? What are you doing here? And he's like, I just really wanted an opportunity to show you what I've got. And they gave him a chance and ended up giving him a job.
Oh man, that's an amazing story. Just to hear that, it just makes you, want to pursue it a lot more, because you already know that if these people could do it, I can do it. And my crazy ideas are not that crazy compared to some of the things that these people do.
Yeah.
So, but you hustled your way in. You've been, killing it ever since. It shows in the background, because one of the things I want to ask you is, you are an Emmy winner, 4 times. So how was it when you got your first win?
I mean, it was a really cool experience, and I'm super grateful for the opportunity to even be nominated. But when you work in the U.S., this is the top thing, in the news industry. So it was a really cool thing to be considered. The first time I was nominated, I did not win. And I went to the awards and was just heartbroken, because I'm like, oh, everyone's walking away and giving these beautiful speeches and walking away with these huge smiles. And here I am going, just got to work harder next year. And the next year I was nominated for 2 awards and won both. So I quickly went from a 0-time Emmy Award winner to a 2-time award winner, like in one night. And it was, yeah, it was just a huge, like incredible honor. And, being someone from Canada, who I started my career in Canada and was building it up in Canada, it actually really getting 2 Emmys really ended up helping my green card process, which is something you would never think of. But being able to win those awards like really helped that process. So now I'm fortunate to say that I've lived in the US for 11 years, and like those are a big reason why I got to stay.
Oh man, you know what? That's great, because that's a huge accomplishment to have. Not too many people, in this industry have one of those, and they've been working, hard like all their life.
And it's like, it just means a lot to me, especially one of them was because of a story I did about wrestling. I mean, and that was really cool to be able to tie my 2 passions together, my passion for broadcasting and my passion for wrestling. And it was a story I told about Gregory Iron, who's the only wrestler who wrestles despite being born with cerebral palsy. And I met him when I was in Cleveland, became friends with him, and was just super inspired by his story. And I said, Greg, would you be okay if I told your story? And he was like, oh my gosh, absolutely. And for that story to be nominated and then win meant that much more to me, because it was a story that meant so much to me. It was so close to my heart. And, it's a story about my friend that I was able to showcase to the world.
Oh man. Do you guys still keep in contact now, or is it a little bit harder with your schedule?
No, I mean, he's still in Cleveland, so I don't see him as often,
right.
But I'm still so inspired by everything that he's built. And that story, if anyone wants to check it out, is on YouTube. It's called An Iron Will. And if you want to check it out, I mean, we did that story like 10 years ago or 9 years ago, but I'm still like, I still get goosebumps when I watch it back now.
Oh man. So you talked about your passion for wrestling. You started to sprinkle in that a little bit. Sure. And I know a lot of our listeners is just like, okay, I want to know about his wrestling stuff, because, in the wrestling world, you're known as like the Oprah Winfrey of interviews, because think about it, everybody in the entertainment business, if you have something to say or, really big to sell, you go to Oprah, If here in the wrestling world, if you have something to really big to say, you go to Chris, because we've seen all the interviews done through you. You started your channel back in 2011. And we already know, listening to your game plan of getting into the entertainment business. So what was the plan when you started this YouTube channel?
Oh, there was no plan. There was no plan at all. I kind of started it by accident. So, working as an entertainment reporter, I was doing some really cool interviews and talking to some amazing people. We're talking actors and directors and comedians and celebrities. And every once in a while, you'd talk to a wrestler. And I just thought that we were kind of like short selling the audience of these people, because unless you were watching that interview at that exact moment when it aired on TV, and at the time I was in Cleveland working for the CBS station, unless you were watching at 6:17 that night, you never saw this interview with Sylvester Stallone or Robert Pattinson or Leonardo DiCaprio or whoever I was interviewing. So I just started putting the like full length versions of these interviews on my YouTube channel, simply as a place for these interviews to live for, ever, other than like airing once on the local TV station and then, disappearing, never to be seen again. And every once in a while, like I mentioned, we'd have a wrestler that would come to town. They'd be promoting Raw, SmackDown, Impact, whatever it was. And I would ask my boss, like, hey, could we interview a wrestler? And when this first happened, my boss was like, yeah, we've done that before. And I went, oh my God, I'm going to get paid to talk to a wrestler. This is unbelievable. And that's really where it began. I would do these interviews with a wrestler, 10, 15-minute interviews. We would air 30-second soundbite from that. And then I'm like, well, the other 14 and a half minutes of this interview is pretty interesting. And I asked questions that as a fan, I was interested in. I'm sure other fans would be interested too. And I think the first one I uploaded was an interview I did with The Miz in 2011. He was about to throw out the first pitch at the Cleveland Indians game, which, by the way, was a great first pitch. It was like 85 miles an hour, like right down the pike. It was great. I uploaded this interview. It's like a 3-minute interview, but in those 3 minutes, he dropped a few little nuggets of knowledge that he had never talked about before in another interview. He said that he was knocked unconscious in the main event at WrestleMania 27 and doesn't remember winning the match. Like, Think about that. WrestleMania moment, standing on the top rope, winning the match, doesn't remember it.
Yeah, I remember he had the documentary series they did on him, and when he said that, I was just like,
yeah,
I could only imagine the fear that was in his, like, the way he was feeling. Like,
I mean,
not
I don't think he has any clue. Like,
yeah.
So he dropped that, and then it was right after the pipe bomb had happened, CM Punk's pipe bomb, and he said that it was the greatest thing to happen in wrestling since the Attitude Era. And I put this up on my YouTube channel, didn't think much about it, and woke up the next day and it had like 6,000 views. And like at the time, that was a ton. I was like, oh my gosh, what the heck happened here? And then the day after that, it had like 36,000 views. And I realized that the news from that interview had been picked up by a bunch of different news sites, and the video just got watched by a bunch of people. And I realized, like, okay, I think we're onto something here. And every time I had a wrestling interview, I would make sure to like ask some interesting questions, put it up on my YouTube channel, and kind of go from there. And in 2018, I went, man, these wrestling interviews are really starting to gain some traction. And then I started to go out of my way to start making these wrestling interviews happen. Instead of just having them when they came to me, I started driving a little bit to make these happen. Or I started, oh, hey, so-and-so, I'm in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, New York. You also live there. Could I come by and do an interview? And that's when it really started to pick up. And, I always say vague goals give vague results. And in 2018, I think up to that point, the most wrestling interviews I'd done in a year was like 18. And I went, what if I could do 40 this year? Like more than double it. And I ended up doing 50 that year. And then in 2019, I went, well, what if I could do 50 this year? Ended up doubling that, and I did 100. And that was when it really started to really gain some momentum. AEW obviously was huge news in 2019. And I had a lot of access to some of those people who were my friends that had been signed by AEW. And here's the first interview with someone like a Sammy Guevara or someone like a Jungle Boy or Luchasaurus. Not first interview, but first like big interview after they were signed. And that's when it really started to pick up from there.
Yeah, because I mean, looking at your interviews, one of the things that I love so much about it is that you let them just express themselves and just talk, whether they want to let out that, out of their chest why they got released or, like upcoming projects that they're working on. I think that's like, you just let them just speak. You probably maybe say a couple of words here and there, and then the rest of them is just them talking. And I think that's one of the main reasons why a lot of people, go to you, because they just feel so comfortable. And besides that, they're your friends, you build such a good relationship with them. But, for like as a fan, that's one of the things that I could probably say that a lot of people just enjoy. It's just like, well, we don't need to hear a Q&A thing. We kind of just want to know, like, what are they thinking at that time? And you just let them express themselves.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. And there's a quote from Larry King that I love, rest in peace. And he said, I never learned anything by talking. And it's so true. I mean, Larry King was one of the greatest of all time because of that exact thing. He would just ask questions. He's just curious.
Chris, give me 1 second, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that.
Everything good?
Yeah. I got in a package. So.
Oh. So I just think for me, it's that I'm genuinely curious. So I ask questions that I legitimately want to know the answer to. And my hope is that if I want to know the answer to it, that other people will want to know the answer to it as well. And, I'm super aware that nobody tunes into my podcast or watches my YouTube channel to see me. Like, I'm very, very aware of that. It's guest driven. And like, that's the whole point of it. It's, to see the people who are the guests there, which is why I changed the name of my podcast. Like, I started my podcast as the Chris Van Vliet Show, honestly, because I didn't know what to call it. I was just taking the audio from my YouTube channel and putting it on my podcast. And I thought, well, I guess we'll just name it after me. And I quickly realized that the show's not about me. And that's why I changed the name earlier this year to Insight with Chris Van Vliet, because that's what it's about. It's about taking the insight from these people who are at the very top of their game, whether they're wrestlers or actors or entrepreneurs or thought leaders, whatever they are. They got to where they're at because of a lot of the processes in their life. And I want to be able to reverse engineer that and like figure it out. So I basically sit there at the learning tree of every single one of these people and just like, tell me more.
Oh man. So has there anybody that you haven't interviewed that hasn't come on the show yet that you want to get on?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. There's like 1,000 people that I want to have on the show. In the wrestling world, I've said this a bunch of times, but I'll keep throwing it out into the universe. It doesn't feel like it will happen, but I'll keep saying it. Vince McMahon would be such a great interview.
Yeah, he doesn't do too many interviews unless it's like a documentary or something.
Yeah.
And it's but
I want to interview him like as the man. Like, sure, what he's built with WWE is unbelievable. I mean, the reason that you and I are talking right now is because of the genius of Vince McMahon and what he built. But I want to know what makes him tick. Like, what's Vince McMahon's workout routine look like?
Exactly.
What is Vince McMahon? How much sleep does he get? Like I want to know these types of things. I'm just curious because you don't get that successful by accident. And I would love to know like what makes him function, what makes him tick. So Vince McMahon would be a great one. I interviewed Oprah briefly early on in my career. I'm so inspired by what she's built. And I mean, you want to talk about a great interviewer. I mean, she's the best. So I would love a longer conversation with her. I've recently listened to a podcast with Ben Stiller. And early in my career, people would tell me I looked like Ben Stiller. So I would love to have a brilliant actor, director, writer, everything, a philanthropist. I would love to sit down with him as well. So there's three completely different people from three completely different walks of life. And then, of course, Joe Rogan would be great. Elon Musk would be a great interview. But yeah, there's a lot of people that I'm inspired by. And I would love to just be able to pick their brain.
So with the success of the show, like, does it blow your mind? Because when I told you before, you're like the Oprah of the wrestling world. Does it blow your mind that so many wrestling talent want to come on your show? Is it something like they reach out to you, or do you mostly just like reach out to them?
I mean, that's really nice of you to say. I don't know how accurate it is. I mean, to be even in the same sentence as Oprah, unless it's like Chris Van Vliet once interviewed Oprah, that's probably the only time when that sentence makes sense. But no, thank you. I actually think Renee Paquette is probably that person right now. Like she's just crushing it. And congratulations to her and John Moxley on the birth of their baby daughter. But I mean, if someone has a story to tell, they're going to Renee now. And I'm happy that I've been able to get some of the interviews that I've been able to get. But yeah, some of them have been from me reaching out. There's been the occasional person that's sent me a random DM and says, hey man, I listened to the show. I'd love to come on. That was how I got the interview with David Benoit. We followed each other on Instagram, and one day he just sent me a random DM. And I said, of course, I'd love to hear your story. And then I flew to Las Vegas and we made that interview happen. So it's a lot of just, I think the biggest thing with having a podcast or having a YouTube channel, especially when you're relying on guests, is what value can you bring? And it's, if you have a platform, I have X amount of listeners, I have X amount of subscribers, I have the access to X, Y, and Z, whatever it happens to be. I think it's so important to lead with value. Right. And I learned that early on in my career as a broadcaster and my career as a journalist. Look, when you're trying to get guests on your show, they're super busy, right? Like we're all busy, but they're very busy and their time is valuable. And I'm basically saying to them, like, I understand that your time is valuable. In exchange for your time, I can give you, insert whatever it is here. Right. And I think that that's a really important way to position this because, I always say the best thing about a podcast is anyone can do it. And the worst thing about a podcast is anyone can do it.
And that is true.
And I say that because it's great that anyone can, turn on their webcam or take out their phone and start being a YouTuber or a podcast. It's amazing. But the worst part about it is now you got to make yourself stand out. It's a needle in a haystack. And what are you going to do to make your show stand out from everybody else who thinks they can do the exact same thing?
So what advice would you give like a newer podcast hosts like myself that's only been doing it for about a year now, as far as like getting guests and, you know, enticing them to come on a show like mine's. Like, you know, I'm grateful that you got to come on here and, like, you know, give us some knowledge as far as, like, you know, an insight into your world.
I would say, Kenny, congratulations to you, because a lot of people dream about starting a podcast. A lot of people talk about it, and it just ends there. The fact that you actually did it and you've been consistent with it for the last year, like, congrats to you, man, because there's a lot of people who don't stick with it. And as you know, when you're starting out and you look at those download numbers, you're like, man, why am I putting all this time and all this effort in if the numbers aren't nearly as big as I expected them to be? So I think in terms of getting guests on, it's just a matter of like continuing to do it. Like, just be consistent. Your guests don't all have to be WWE superstars or former WWE superstars or current AEW, Impact, Ring of Honor, New Japan, whatever. I would say talk to anybody who has an interesting story, which is literally everybody. Everybody has an interesting story. It's just a matter of being able to pull that out of them. And I think that when you're pitching people, it's important to go, so I've had this person, this person, this person, and this person on, which I think that sometimes, like, listing off that resume makes people go, oh, if that person was willing to do it, oh, I could definitely, or maybe they reach out to that person. Maybe they're friends with that person. They go, hey, this guy Kenny reached out to me. What was your experience like in his podcast? Oh, it was good. Oh, great. Okay, I'll do that. I think it's important to position this in the most valuable way possible for that person. And also, I mean, I think this goes without saying, but unfortunately, too many people do this when they're trying to pitch guests. Is don't just cut and paste the email that you sent to this person A may not work for person B. In fact, it likely won't work for person B. So I would say treat it like if you were going to go try to pick up a girl or pick up a guy, I think that you wouldn't approach, you know, this girl with this pickup line and then, oh, that doesn't work, I'll just go to this girl and say the exact same line. You know, it's probably not going to work that way. So I would say treat each individual situation as a unique situation.
You know, and that's great, because it's so true. Because, you know, when I started doing this and like pitching, you know, like interviews to like different people, I noticed it was like sometimes it wouldn't hit as well. So I had to change my approach a lot at the time. So, like, you know, hearing this is great, because at least I know the things that I'm doing is actually working.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You'll find out what works and what doesn't work, and you know, you'll get yourself on a tear where things are really working for a while, and then maybe, you know, it's a little cold for a little while, but you'll definitely figure out what happens. And I think you'll definitely figure out what works. But I think it's important to look like 5 episodes ahead always. So, you know, you're recording this week, but what's your next episode? And then the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. Because if one of those falls through, well, all of a sudden, like if you only have one in the can, if that one falls through, well, now what? Now you're scrambling.
Oh yeah, that's true. That happened to me like maybe the first 3 months in, I was just like, okay, I have like these people. I think I should be good. And then all of a sudden it was just like one person fell through. And I was like, oh man. So then I kind of just changed a lot. And, you know, I'm grateful now that I can like book guests on a regular basis where it's like consistently happening for me now. So that's, you know, but I definitely understand where you're coming from when you say that.
I think it's important to to ask yourself, why do you do it? That is the most important thing. If you're starting a podcast or you're starting a YouTube channel, I think the most important thing is to ask yourself, why am I starting this? Right. And if the answer is because I want to get famous, cool. Chase after that and figure out what the path is to get there. If the answer is I enjoy making content, I love talking to interesting people, that's great too. You know, figure out that path and go down it.
Oh man. But Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to let you go because I feel like we can sit here and talk for hours. But is there anything you want to plug in right now with a lot of my listeners?
I appreciate you, man. Thank you so much for having me on, Kenny. And wherever people are listening to this right now, you can listen to my podcast, Insight with Chris Van Vliet. And on YouTube, it's just my name, and it's my name on all social media. Chris Van Vliet, VanVliet.
Oh, man, that's great. Guys, give it up one more time for CVV.
Thanks, man.